take a moment and take a look at this picture. What do you perceive the situation to be here? Who are these people to one another, and what are they doing? Are they indoors or are they outdoors? What's the square object above the head of the woman in this picture? What is the vertical post in the middle of the picture? Well, if you're from North America, you most likely answered that this is a family. They're indoors and they're playing some kind of a game. The square object above the head of the woman is a window inside the house. And the vertical beam is the corner of the room with the little fingers coming off showing that that's a corner. If you were from Africa, however, you would perceive this picture completely differently. You would perceive this still as a family or community, maybe neighbors and friends, also playing a game. You would, however, perceive this as being outdoors, not indoors. The vertical object in the middle of the screen is a tree, and the little fingers coming off of that are tree branches going up to the heavens. The object above the head of the woman is not a window, it's a box. For you see, in that culture, they often carry boxes on their heads as a way of carrying things. Isn't it interesting that just because we're from different cultures, we see something totally different in this picture? This week we're going to take a look at two very important concepts. Well, actually, it's almost the same concept, just used in a different way. We're going to be looking at perception, and we'll define that for you and talk about what perception is. And then we're going to talk about cultural patterns that exist around the world. We're going to talk about the 5 most common distinctions in worldview or perceptual patterns that exist. These are, in essence, a very similar idea because perception of the world leads to certain perceptual patterns. So they're very intertwined, these ideas of perception and cultural patterns. At the very end of this lecture, we're going to look at some other common cultural patterns that are distinctive beyond just those 5 major ones. Now, this video lecture is going to be divided into 2 parts because it's quite a large lecture this week. So you'll get the first half here, and then you'll need to go back in and upload the second part of the lecture. I did this just so we wouldn't have an overwhelmingly big file for you to upload so that D2L could handle that. So don't forget when you finish this section to go back in and upload the second half. Let's get started. Let's begin by defining the word perception. Perception is the process whereby people convert external events and experiences into meaningful internal understanding. This is a great definition. Basically, we take what we see or perceive or experience through our senses. We talked about this last week when we talked about the communication process. We receive the messages around us through channels, and then we decode them and we attach meaning, and that's the process of perception in a nutshell. The interesting thing about perception is that no 2 people perceive any situation exactly the same. Part of this is because perception is selective. And what that means is out of a lot of stimuli around us, out of a lot of possible things that we can pay attention to, we tend to focus on certain things. Sometimes this is because certain things stand out or are more noticeable or louder perhaps. Sometimes it's just because we're interested in certain things. So if you're in a crowded room and a lot of people are talking, like a big party, maybe you're a music lover, so you tend to select and pay attention to the music going on in that situation, while another person might be really interested in a certain game going on or a certain conversation, and they may tune into that. So some of it is a personal preference, some of it is a cultural preference, some of it is just the stimuli, the degree of loudness, whether it be visual or auditory, of the stimuli, but we select out certain things to pay attention to. The other part of this is that perception is learned, and that happens through our cultural experiences as well as our individual personal growing up experiences. So we learn to pay attention to certain things, but even more importantly, we learn to interpret our experiences in certain ways. So maybe we're in a store and we see a child throwing a temper tantrum. And, maybe we grew up in a really strict family where that was not tolerated. And so as we perceive that situation and we take in that information, we perceive that as, oh, what a bad acting child, what a rude kid, what terrible behavior. Maybe the person standing next to us was raised in a family where expression of that sort was encouraged and there wasn't a lot of tight discipline. And so they see that and they just kind of laugh and say, "Oh, look at that, just a kid being a kid." And they have a very different perception of the situation. So these perceptions and the interpretations and the meanings that we put on everything we experience is based on universals, culturals, and personals. Universals being our human experience of seeing, hearing, culturals being what our culture teaches us about that situation and how to perceive it, and then, of course, personals, our own personal experiences and biases that influence the way we perceive things. I had an old professor in graduate school who used to explain perception in this way. He said, perception is like eyeglasses. We all have a little different prescription, and therefore we all see the world a little bit differently. And I thought that was a really great picture to help us understand perception. As we begin to move into our discussion of the different cultural patterns that exist around the world, we're really looking at perceptual patterns or ways of viewing things that differ from culture to culture and people to people. So, what we see on the outside culturally is the behaviors. For example, we might go into a culture and we might see that they take their shoes off when they go into a home. That's a behavior. But behind every cultural behavior, there are beliefs and values. And really, the beliefs and values are what we're going to be looking at when we study these cultural patterns that are coming up beginning in the next slide. So I want you to understand the distinction. I like to look at this like a plant. A plant has stems and leaves, and then it has roots as well. The leaves or the flowers are like the behaviors. They're the things that we see. The stems are like the belief system. It holds up the leaves and the flowers, or it is basically the backbone of the way that we behave, the reason we behave the way we do. And then the values are like the roots. They're the deeper part that are kind of our deeply held judgments of why we do things. So let's look at these definitions. Our perceptions are really stored within us as these beliefs and these values. So let's look first at the idea of beliefs. Beliefs are basically just accepted truths about the way that the world works. So if I take my shoes off before I go into a home, I have an accepted belief that shoes should be worn outside, but they should never be worn inside. That's my belief. That's just the way the world works, or my understanding of the way the world works. Now, below that, there is the values structure. And these are much more deeply held rules for making choices and judgments, for resolving conflicts and deciding on moral and immoral. So the values are really at the heart of the beliefs, and then the beliefs are at the heart of the behaviors. So if I take my shoes off when I go into a home, that's my behavior. My belief is that shoes should be worn outside but never inside. And my value is separation of the outside world for the inside world. Also, probably cleanliness, my belief or my deeply held value in keeping the home sacred and clean and free of any outside dirt or dust or filth. So that's a deeper held value that really serves as a root of everything I do in terms of beliefs and then behaviors. So as we move through the next few slides and really look at these cultural patterns, uh, the understanding of where they come from and the idea that there's more than just what's on the surface that is supporting my viewpoint is really important to understand. All right, so let's look at the first of our cultural patterns. The first distinction that we're going to look at is called individualism versus collectivism. This is the most fundamental perceptual difference that exists between cultures. It makes a difference in terms of every other dimension that we're going to look at. So this is really foundational. You absolutely need to understand the distinction in worldview and perception that exists between these two philosophies. Let's look at a couple of things that these two are not. One of the stereotypes about those from individualistic cultures is that they're self-centered and self-focused and not generous. They're sort of stingy. All they care about is themselves. Well, the United States is one of the most individualistic cultures in the world. It's also one of the most generous. So certainly, just because you're from an individualistic culture doesn't mean you're going to be self-centered or not generous. Individuals from an individualistic culture do care about their family members. They do care about their friends. They are compassionate individuals. So it doesn't equal selfishness necessarily. Also, on the other side, collectivism tends to be associated a lot with communism. People think if you're collectivistic, you're automatically communist. Now, this is an interesting relationship because it does seem that as we look at the communist countries in the world and those that have a communist or a very socialist mentality, that almost all of them, in fact, all of them that we know of, are collectivistic. So it seems like if you're communist in mentality, that you will have a collectivistic culture. However, just because you're collectivist doesn't mean you're communist. So there are collectivistic cultures around the world that are not communist. So it's an interesting relationship. It works one way, but not necessarily the other. Also, people think those in collectivistic cultures are sort of like robots. They don't have a mind of their own, they don't think on their own. And certainly that's not true. There are still individuals within collectivistic cultures, and they know that they have an identity that is separate from a group. So they're not mindless sort of drones fulfilling the work of the larger hive or whatever. That's an exaggeration, certainly a stereotype. Now, what I want you to remember as we begin to go through these patterns as well is that as I describe the two different worldviews, we're going to be looking at them on the extreme. So we're going to be defining individualism on the one extreme side and collectivism on the other extreme side. But remember that cultures fall in the middle too. So most cultures are not going to be extremely individualistic or extremely collectivist. They're going to lean more individualist or lean more collectivist. And there's only going to be a few cultures that are going to be way on the strong end of these different aspects. So keep that in mind. So with that said, let's look at the fundamental difference between these two cultures. This is really important that you understand this. The fundamental difference is how an individual sees or views him or herself in relationship to others. So in an individualistic culture, let's look at some of these aspects here. The self is seen as a separate and a distinct entity. It's really important for individuals in an individualistic cultures to think of themselves as unique, not the same as anyone else, with special gifts and special talents, and being separate. So if you ask me, who are you? I identify myself as Meredith Gibbons. I'm separate, I'm distinct. That's my identity as an individual. I wouldn't necessarily immediately say, well, I'm Jason's wife, or I'm the mother of Rylan and Kyler, my two boys. I wouldn't first identify myself that way. I would probably first just identify myself as Meredith Gibbons. I am a distinct human being with distinct identity. Also, in an individualistic culture, the self is seen as unique, possessing special qualities and potential. There's an idea in individualistic cultures of the uniqueness of the self, that everybody has their own gifts, that everybody has their own talents, and that the goal of an individual is to discover that. Also, we have here individuals are their goals, whatever their individual goals for achievement are, are usually put up above group goals. So if I want to make more money or I want a better career, I'm going to go and do that, and I'm not going to necessarily consider first how it's going to affect the groups that I'm in. Now, some groups I will. For example, I'll probably consider my family before I take a job across country. But I'm probably not going to necessarily consider, at least not in the final decision, how it will affect my coworkers or other members of groups that I'm a part of. So only the closest groups are considered, and the individual goals are usually what is sought after in terms of achievement. Now, you might say, well, that makes you selfish. Well, in some ways, but it's a mentality within the culture that leads to incredible individual achievement. Individuals are able to achieve because they're freed up to really seek self actualization, to really begin to achieve the things that they feel that they are called to do. So it can be a very positive, of course, within the culture as well. Behavior is guided by personal goals. What do you want to accomplish? What are you good at? What do you want to achieve? Those are the things that primarily guide you in an individualistic culture. All right. Also, in an individualistic culture, individuals pursue their own personal fulfillment. They look for ways to better themselves, to climb the ladder in career, in family, in all areas of their lives. They think they have the mentality that that individuals should get better as they grow, that they should make more money, that they should gain knowledge, that they should gain education, that they should become wiser, smarter, better at whatever it is they do. So there's a definite feeling of individual growth that accompanies this idea of individualism. Also, in an individualistic culture, individual responsibility for actions is typically a key part of that. So if I make a mistake, it's my fault. It's not the group's fault. It's not my family's fault. It's my fault. If I do something well, I also individually receive praise for that. That's my accomplishment. That's my achievement. That's my reward to receive. So instead of a group reward, we give individual rewards, we give individual grades. You earn your own way in life. That is a key mentality or key concept in an individualistic culture. So continuing now with our discussion of individualism, this idea that the self is a unique, separate, and distinct individual, distinct and separate from others in terms of our identity, let's look at some of the conditions that seem to breed, if you will, or seem to grow individualism within a culture. There's a few things. First of all, affluence, which means money. Richer cultures tend to become more individualistic. This is probably due to the fact that you're not needing to pull together with the community in order to survive. If you don't have enough food for tomorrow, you don't really care about climbing the corporate ladder. You care about working together as a team so that everybody can eat and sustain themselves. And it doesn't matter so much that, we're getting the job that we want or that we're becoming more educated. So the more wealth that's in a culture, the more freed up an individual is to go out and seek their own identity and their own personal fulfillment. Geographic separation. It seems that the two most individualistic cultures in the world are the United States and Australia. Both of these cultures are geographically separated from other cultures around them. There's ocean on two sides of us in the United States, ocean all around for Australia. So it seems that being separated and free from the influence of other cultures tends to create an environment where individualism can grow and thrive. Again, this may be partly due to the fact that if you're surrounded by other cultures, you feel more of a group sense of identity. So we have to pull together because we're surrounded by so many other cultures. So if we want to survive, we have to develop a group mentality. That seems to happen more in cultures that are not geographically separated, and that makes them more collectivistic. But when you're separated, you don't have that threat. You don't have that outward threat, uh, not just of invasion, but of influence. You're not threatened by the influence of other cultures coming in. So there isn't that need to kind of pull together one for all for one, and create more of a collectivist mentality. You don't have that need. So therefore, you're more individualistic. Colonization, again, both the United States and Australia were cultures that began as colonies of other cultures. This maybe in part contributes to individualism because you've got people from all different cultures coming together, settling in a new culture, and they have brought with them their own unique backgrounds, their own unique cultures. So, right from the get go, you've got a melting pot, you've got a variation of cultures trying to coexist, which tends to create that feeling of, hey, you do your own thing, I'll do my own thing, you've got your own culture, you've got your own traditions, I've got my own traditions. Let's all just survive together, but respect each other's differences. So that's the idea here of colonization tending to create more of a mentality of individualism. Also, you think about the people that are coming over and being brave enough to go settle in a new world. These are people who want a better life, who are out to better themselves and their families. So they kind of just have that built in individualistic mentality from the get go. You also tend to have a heterogeneous population. That means they're not all the same culture. They don't all look the same. They don't all act the same. They're different. They're unique. Some of them have black hair. Some of them have black skin. Some of them have white skin. Some of them have brown skin. So you've got this variation in the way that we all look, which in and of itself creates a feeling of we're all different. We're all unique. So that tends to be an influence as well. All right, then on the other side, we've got some of the key values that exist in an individualistic culture. Equality is definitely high on the list because we can't self actualize if we don't feel that we're equal to others. So, individualistic cultures must have a sense of equality among their members. You're just as good as I am, I'm just as good as you are, and that's a very high value in individualistic cultures. Freedom, you have to have the freedom to move up, to improve the self, to grow. You're not stuck in a caste or a class, but you have this ability to really achieve because of freedom. Another value is competition. And when I say competition in this case, I mean competition between individuals. Collectivistic cultures have competition as well, but the competition that exists in a collectivist culture tends to be more between groups and not individuals, whereas in an individualistic culture, the competition that exists is individual to individual. So don't think that all collectivistic cultures don't have competition, because you almost need competition within a culture in order to really have change and progress. So competition is needed in all of these, but in individualistic cultures, it tends to be individual to individual competition. Uh, Also, of course, if you don't have competition, you don't know how to gauge yourself. You don't know how to scale how well you're doing. How well am I doing as an individual? If you can't look at someone else and say, well, they're doing a little better, they're making a little more money, they're a little bit ahead in the career, I need to step it up, I need to work harder. That is an essential part of individualism. So competition needs to exist there. Self-determination. I can make myself succeed. It's up to me. I don't need others, or I don't rely on others. And independence, not interdependence, but independence. And this is why we have a hard time. One of the difficulties in an individualistic culture is what happens when you become a dependent person through a disability, or through getting older and not being able to take care of yourself. And this is why often in individualistic cultures, unfortunately, those who cannot take care of themselves fall to the wayside or not treated particularly well in the culture, because that value of being able to take. Several years ago, there was a study done where they went into a Japanese elementary school and an American elementary school and gave them the same instructions. And they wanted to see the distinction between the way these two groups would complete a very simple task. The task they gave the students in both cultures was to draw a picture of their family. Well, the thing they noticed right away was in the Japanese classroom, the teacher was up high. There was a stage for the teacher, so she was placed on a higher pedestal than the students. In the American class, everything was at the same level. The teacher had no stage and was on the same level with the students. Very interesting. We'll look at that distinction here in a minute. The next thing they noticed is that the Japanese class handed out paper and pencil, and everyone in the class waited to start their drawings until all of the students had received paper and pencil. So they held the paper there at their desk and they waited, and then the teacher gave a command when they all were to start drawing. In the American classroom, as soon as the student received their paper and pencil, they immediately began to draw. They did not wait for all individuals in the class to receive their papers. So that was a distinction they noticed right away. Then the second thing they noticed is when the Japanese students began to draw their family members, they began with the senior-most position in the family, usually a grandfather. So they would draw the grandfather first, and then the grandmother, and then their father, and then their mother, and then they would draw each of their siblings in the rank of the oldest to the youngest. And they would only draw themselves when they came wherever they fell in the hierarchy, where their turn was. The American students, in contrast, usually drew themselves first and usually right in the center of the page. They would put the big picture of themselves and then they would draw their family members around them. The other distinction they found is when they were done, the Americans were very competitive. The American students hurried up to finish their drawings, and immediately when they were done, they raced to the front to drop off their pictures. The Japanese students, in contrast, would wait again until everyone had finished their drawing, and then someone would be assigned to come around and collect the pictures all at the same time as a group there. So, very interesting distinctions, and it points out, it highlights some of the different values that exist between individualism and collectivism. On this slide, let's take a closer look at collectivism. We've looked at some of the values of individualism, but let's look now at some of the values of collectivism. In a collectivistic culture, an individual sees him or herself primarily as defined by their roles in groups. So when someone asks who you are, if I'm at home, for example, I would say, oh, I'm Jason's wife, or I'm Rylan and Kyler's mom. If someone were to ask who I was at work, I would say, oh, I'm Meredith Gibbons, the professor at Johnson of Communication at Johnson County Community College. So I would identify myself that way. So I primarily see myself as I function in relationship to others within groups. Rather than being this separated and distinct and unique entity, I am the roles I play in relationship to others. So my identity in a collectivistic culture is very wrapped up in my relationships with other people. And this isn't just my family members. The really amazing thing about collectivistic cultures is the number of groups that they're a part of and the absolute identity that they have with these different groups. We have that in an individualistic culture with our family somewhat, but they have it with many, many groups. Their work group, their neighborhood groups, their school groups that they went to school with, so on and so forth. So they identify themselves according to those roles. Group goals usually take precedent over individual goals in a collectivistic culture. So I receive an offer for more money, but I'm going to first consider my family and my work group and how it's going to affect them, and I'm going to heavily weigh that in making a decision. And usually I'm going to do what's best for the group rather than necessarily what's best for me. As I mentioned before, collectivistic cultures have a lot of groups. So they have these extended primary groups. One of the things, Japan is the culture that I'm most familiar with and that I've spent a lot of time in. And one of the things I noticed when I went to Japanese high school there, when I was about 15, I went there on a summer program, and they have summer school in Japan. So I got to attend Japanese high school at a very young age. And one of the things I found out was that rather than changing groups year to year, the Japanese are very intentional about trying to keep groups together. So you'll go to elementary school with a certain class, and then they'll intentionally put you with the same group throughout your primary years of school. And what happens is, of course, these groups get very close and they're lifelong friends, because by the time you finish school, you spent 12 very long years with these people, these same groups of people. It's interesting to contrast the American practice of actually intentionally mixing up groups and not putting the same groups together year after year after year, but rather, exchanging them or changing them up a little bit. Also, in collectivistic cultures, responsibility is shared and accountability is collective. When I was attending Japanese high school back when I was 15, there were a couple of members of the school who had gotten spotted by a community member at a local 7-Eleven during the middle of a school day. Now, keep in mind, they wear uniforms in Japanese high schools, so it was easy for this community member, whoever it was, to identify right away, hey, there's students here from a school and know exactly which school it was. They shouldn't be here. They're skipping school. So they'd telephone the school and say, hey, we saw a couple of your students, saw your uniforms, knew it was your school that was at 7-Eleven in the middle of the day, obviously skipping school. Well, the school made absolutely no attempt to find out who the individual students were, but instead the entire class was forced to stay after basically a detention kind of thing. Actually, what they made them do is an hour and a half of group exercise at the end of the day as a punishment. And I found that so interesting that there was no attempt made to find the actual individuals who did this. Now, of course, within the students, they knew, right, who did this. But the idea of the school was that they had a responsibility as a group to make sure that none of their friends were skipping, to stop them from skipping. And so, because as a group they didn't do that, everyone deserved to be punished. So it's a very different mentality in a collectivistic culture. So accountability, whether it's good or bad, whether you do something good or bad, it's usually the mentality is that without the group supporting you, you couldn't have done well, and without the group failing you, you wouldn't have done badly. So there's a very different mentality in that regard. Obligations are based on your role and your rank and your status. How high or low you are on the hierarchy of power influences a lot of what you can and cannot do. Roles are very clearly defined in collectivistic culture. So what you're supposed to do as a teacher or as a parent or as a secretary or as a policeman or as a grandparent, whatever role you're playing, they're very well defined. There's not a lot of ambiguity in those roles. You're supposed to do this, and that's what's expected of you. They're also usually strictly ranked, so you know who's above whom and what the hierarchy is. Individuals are expected to perform the role that they're in well, and that's your primary thing, not to individually climb the ladder, but to function within the group, do your job, so to speak, within the group so that the group will function well and succeed. All right, let's look at some of the conditions out of which come a collectivistic mentality. The first is a homogeneous population. So this would be a population where everyone looks pretty much the same, has the same color hair, the same look to them. So those cultures which are racially and culturally the same tend to be more collectivistic, and that makes sense, right? We all look the same, we all have the same culture, we're not all coming from different places. We feel more a part of each other, we feel more like a group. Also, the other thing is a long history. The longer and the older the cultures are, the more collectivist they tend to become. Again, that might be because they have such a common sense of identity that has developed over a period of time. When you think about the youngest cultures in the world, those are, of course, North America, South America, Australia. These are younger cultures. These tend to be more individualistic cultures, with, of course, a lot of exceptions to that rule, but nevertheless, that's where you see more individualism. All right, let's look at some of the values, the primary values. Look how different these values are from the individualistic values. The first value of a collectivistic culture is typically harmony. We want everybody to function together, to get along, to be efficient as they work together as a group. Ooh, we might not like this one so much in an individualistic culture. Maybe, obedience is not real high on our like list usually, but in a collectivistic culture, that is a very high value. You need to be obedient to others in authority, and you need to be obedient to the constraints and restraints of your role, whatever role it is you're playing. Traditions and customs are very valued, particularly as related to the past and your history. Notice the difference here. Interdependence, that is, depending on others, is a very high value, and understanding the extreme importance of needing others and how they need you. Shame is a key mechanism for discipline in a collectivistic culture. I was in a train once in Japan, and a little girl was behaving badly, and the mother, though, I guess she didn't think I could speak Japanese, but I did speak Japanese, and she was trying to get this child to behave properly, and finally, out of exasperation, she sort of pointed a finger in my direction and, in Japanese, of course, said to the child, "Do you see that American? You're embarrassing all Japanese people right in front of that American. She's laughing at you because you're acting so badly as a Japanese person, a Japanese citizen." And I remember just being absolutely shocked. For one thing, I wasn't staring. For another thing, I wasn't laughing. But just thinking, wow, what a pressure that is for that poor young child who has the weight of representing all of Japanese culture by their behavior. But that's very common in collectivistic cultures. You're representing the group. It isn't just about your own behavior. It's about the group. And therefore, you need to act appropriately as not to shame others who are associated and identified with you. Very, very interesting. We're going to move now to part 2 of this lecture, so you will need to upload the next set of slides to continue on with our second pattern.